He's a friend and he is an expert on history of Archibald. And I'm going to plagiarize from a little excerpt that was in the paper yesterday, which if you read, fine. His topic is going to be 1845 Gravity Railroad extension and the development of the borough of Archibald, including photos, maps, stories, and some corrections to the development, as well as signs and remains of the railroad as it passed through the town. Mr. Ed Casey.
I'd like to welcome everybody tonight for the discussion. I'm going to be talking about the development, the important development of the Gravity Railroad and then how it played in the development of the borough of Archibald and actually the coal industry in the Lackawanna Valley. Some people don't realize that there were actually two different gravity railroads. There was the Delaware and Hudson Gravity Railroad that ran from the final ending in Oliphant up to Honesdale through Carbondale, and then there was a second gravity railroad by the Pennsylvania Coal Company, and that ran from Pittston to Hawley. And actually, Archibald had gravity railroads on each side of the mountain, because when you go back over the other side of the mountain and you head towards Phillips Manor and Cortez, you can see the roadbed for the Pennsylvania Coal Company's gravity railroad. But I'm going to be primarily focusing on the gravity railroad on this side of the mountain. There were a lot of details that were covered in our centennial book that we published in 1976. And I'm going to try to steer away from a lot of that material and just present some new things that we've come across in the last few years. One of the first things that I'm going to do is just go over some terms, and then even talk about the fact that it was James Archibald that made some of the changes in the gravity railroad that made it gravity. He didn't build the one from Carbondale to Honesdale, but he certainly revised it and built a new line. He built the first line down here to Archibald, but he was no longer with the D&H when it came time for the extension in 1859 down to Oliphant. But he was responsible for building and developing the entire Pennsylvania Coal Company's gravity railroad from Pittston to Hawley. Just some of the terms and how it works. Some terms: plane or inclined plane. Railroad cars would be pulled up a steep incline, first by chains, but when they became not feasible because they kept breaking, then they went to hemp ropes, and then finally they developed steel cables. And if you think about it, similar to the start of a roller coaster, where when the cars go around and get hooked up and they gradually pull you up to the top, and then from there you roll all the way down. That's what we would talk about by a plane or an inclined plane. And in Archibald, the planes were A, B, C, and D. And later, they were renumbered. A was equal to plane 27, B 26, C 21, and D was known as 25. The reasons that the numbers are not in order is because they numbered down the light track to Oliphant, then swung around on the loaded track and came back up numbering on the loaded side. Now, the difference between a plane and a level, the levels were originally those level stretches of track that ran between the planes. Railroad cars would be pulled by horses, and originally the D&H had planned on getting locomotives to run between Waymart and Honesdale to pull the cars. That's why it was level. And it was the reason why they sent to England and had engines ordered. One was the Stourbridge Lion, that was delivered to Homestead and became the first locomotive to run on working railroad in the United States. What happened is the Sturbridge Lion was 2 tons heavier than the tracks would support and then what they had originally ordered, and they were afraid that it wouldn't last on the tracks and it was retired. There is a replica of it in the Honesdale Historical Society, and the original boiler is down in the Smithsonian Institution. James Archibald changed the levels so that they were slanted towards the next plane. The cars would roll by themselves to the next plane instead of having to be dependent upon horses. Now Archibald also designed 2 separate and distinct rail lines for it. The loaded track, it was on this track, the levels were slanted towards the canal to deliver coal to Honesdale. And he developed a separate light track. The levels were slanted back towards the mines to bring the empty cars to be filled again. This design also increased the capacity of the railroad greatly. The planes, most of them were powered by stationary steam engines at the top of the plane. And except for the one in Archibald, the seaplane, was originally developed to run by water wheel. And we'll talk a little bit about that later on. Also, the top of the plane, the head of the plane, would be considered the top, where the steam engines were and where the cars would be released to roll down to the next level. And the foot of the plane would be at the bottom. So just to know as we're going through it and we're describing some of the pictures, you'll know what we're talking about regarding that. And this is an example of a plane. It's down in Oliphant, and you can see where the tracks were slanted up. At the head of the plane, there is the house where the steam engines were, and you can see in the center of the track, you can see the rollers that the cable would be on, that they would attach the cars to pull them up. Originally, the cars were much smaller. This is the one designed in 1939. They were the first coal wagons. And they were only designed to handle about 2.5 tons. Later on, they would be designed to be much larger. The reason that they were designed to be 2.5 tons is because they really hadn't developed T-rails. And T-rails would be the rails that we see on the railroad now. What they were using then as a rail bed, they would have 6x9 hemlock ties laid every 10 feet. And they didn't have any ballast, any rock to hold them in place. And what would happen is there would be 6x12 rails fixed on them every 10 feet. And the rails were set in slots so that they would be 4 feet and 3 inches wide. So that's what the gauge was on the railroad, 4 feet 3 inches. And then what they did is they screwed iron straps 2.5 inches wide by 1/2 inch thick on the surfaces of the rails, the hemlock rails, so that they would handle the wear and tear of the cars. They began to find out that when there were knots in the hemlock, it was solid. Where there were not knots, it started to dip. So what they ended up doing later on was taking and putting oak strips on top of the rails to try to make them a little bit smoother so that they would run. And then eventually what would happen in 1856, the whole line would be equipped with T-rails as we know them now. This is the final design for the gravity car. It was 12 feet 8 inches by 4 feet 2 inches, and the wheels were 26 inches. And this carried 5 tons of coal, so it was twice as much as the smaller cars. And the brakes, okay, were in between the wheels here. You can see them in here and in here. And they were activated by these levers, okay, and they're better visible by the front of the car. And this is what the person who was riding the car would use to lock the brakes. Now remember, there were no engines. These cars were just chained together. And the only way that they can control them on the levels were to engage the brakes on so many cars to slow it down. And sometimes the cars could be as much as 85 in a row, connected together. But when they got to the planes, they could only take up 5 at a time. So they would haul 5 up at a time and then reform the train at the top of the level and then send them down to the next. They also started in 1877, in order to increase the use of the gravity railroad, they also started passenger service. And passenger service was running until 1899, when the gravity railroad finally closed down. They had various different types of cars. This car is also available or visible at the Honesdale Historical Society. And you can notice that the inside is quite comfortable. Some of the rail cars, the passenger cars, just had wooden planks that ran the whole length and you just sat there. In the summertime, because they would have special excursions, especially up to the top of Farview Mountain, where there would be a picnic ground and an observation tower, they would have open cars, because there was no air conditioning, and these would be just cars with a roof on, but opened all along so people could enjoy the view. And it became a very, very famous ride. It was like taking a 26-mile roller coaster ride throughout the valley and having some great views and scenery. This is the final shape of the Delaware and Hudson Gravity Railroad. Starting in Honesdale, where the canal was. Okay. James Archibald designed a light track, and you can see on this map that they also indicate in here with these dotted lines places where the old track was and where Archibald had redone it. So he made a separate light track that would bring all of the empty cars back to the mines, and he had a separate loaded track that would bring the coal cars to Honesdale. There the cars would be emptied into large piles, and they would fill the canal boats that would then go 108 miles to Roundout, which was on the upper end of the Hudson River. And from Roundout, the coal would be floated down the Hudson River to New York City and sold, or it would be floated up to Albany. Those were the two markets that the D&H had targeted for the sale of their coal. They decided, the Wirtz brothers, when they originally were planning, stayed away from the Philadelphia market because all of the lower anthracite coal fields were serving Philadelphia, and the market wasn't as great. There's a couple things that we're interested in here. If you say you're from the Bush in Carbondale, and that's where the Caseys come from, the Bush in Carbondale. It was originally called Bushwick, okay? And there was a link between the loaded and the light track established there in 1877, so that the passenger cars coming down from Honesdale and Waymart could swing into Carbondale without having to come all the way down to Archibald to go back. There was also one down here in Archibald that connected the loaded and the light track so that the empty cars could be sent to the mines that were on the west side of the river. One of the things that's interesting is that once this new light track was established, the cars, the light cars, would roll from the top of the Carbondale Mountain all the way down to Archibald with no intervening planes. So there was no reason to have any sort of motive power. It would just go all the way down. When the extension was built from the area up here into Oliphant, the cars would roll all the way down to Seaplane, which is down where the baseball field is on Laurel Street. Archibald was noted more for his Pennsylvania Coal Company Railroad because he had a 47-mile area that had no power but gravity alone as it was going along. Now, White Oak Run was the name of the village, and it was in Blakely Township, Luzerne County. We have to remember that Lackawanna County was the last county that was made. So when we're talking about the early history of the borough in this area, looking at the fact that we were part of Luzerne County. Now, White Oak Run, which is the creek that runs right outside here, was the name of the area. And this is what it looked like in 1844. This was just after James Archibald and James Clarkson. I kept asking Richie Clarkson if he's a relative, but he doesn't own up to it. But anyway, this is just after they came down to start to look for and explore the land south of Carbondale that the D&H owned to look for coal deposits. And Archibald was a great spot to find it in, because if you're coming up the industrial highway and if you look across, there's a ridge in the valley that cuts right across through Archibald. That's where the Einan section was called the Ridge first. And there were Welsh farmers up there who were farming and supplying Carbondale with the necessary food goods. But what made it important was that because mining techniques were not developed that well at the time, they would look for coal seams, and in the northern coal field, which is our area, this was a huge lake bed. The coal seams are this way, and some of the other ones, they're very steep and they're jagged. But here, you could start at the coal seam and you could mine up into it, and you didn't have to worry about the water flooding the mines because it would drain out naturally. And because of this ridge that sits in the middle, there's extra coal layers here. So there was coal on that side, there was coal on this side, and they were both able to be developed. And this was found to be a very good site to develop the mines. What happened is, after they were exploring, the two engineers went back to Carbondale and they began to devise a plan to have the gravity railroad to come down to the new mines that they were going to open. And the first mines, 1 and 2, were along the White Oak Run, about 400 feet past the tracks here. Now, in this picture, this is the Lackawanna River in the middle. Okay? The bridge here is on the site of the present Gilmartin Street Bridge. And that was the only bridge that was in the town for a number of years. And here was a blacksmith shop that was established by D.G. Sly that actually stood in the town until 1885. The bridge that was on Gilmartin Street was built by R.S. Benjamin. We don't know who got the deer. Archibald was known for being a good hunting area because of the very deep White Oak Gorge that runs up the mountain. What they could do is they could drive the deer up towards the gorge, and then the deer would be trapped because there was no way they could get from one side to the other. So it was easy prey for the hunters in the area. At the time, within the borough limits, the only area that was inhabited was up on the ridge where the Welsh farmers were, and a lumber mill that was down where Delaware Street is. D&H developed this side of the river. Eaton and Company, which later became Jones and Simpson when Alvar Eaton died, developed the west side of the river. This is a painting of James Archibald. He was the first mayor of Carbondale, and this painting was made around 1845. So it was right around the same time that he was in charge of the D&H, and he was developing the railroad for down in this area. You can see this is a photograph that was taken of him. We don't know what year that was taken, but it doesn't look much different than the painting. And that painting hangs in City Hall because they have him in the Hall of Mayors. Now, this is a map of the area in 1894. One of the reasons that I put it in here is just so that you can see the importance that developing and sending the gravity railroad down this far played in the development of the borough. The main road at the time was called the Providence-Carbondale Turnpike, and it's now the main street in Einan and the Einan-German Road. Carbondale was the important center, and the courthouse was there for Luzerne County. The road was devised because it would run through where the farmers were. In 1845, with the extension of the gravity to White Oak Run, the road was rerouted. And there was an extension made to it so that the main road would come down. If you went to the Mid-Valley Hospital and you took the right, that's where the road started. And if you head up to German, where the main street meets the Einan-German Road, that's where it would meet. The reason that that extension was made is because there was no other transportation from Archibald down below. And we'll talk about that in a little while. Also, the road was a toll road. And in order to make driving on it a little bit easier, the road was planked. So if you're driving along, and especially when you hit Mayfield, you'll see Old Plank Road. That's part of the extension of that, and that's what it means. Because from the Mid-Valley, through Archibald, and up through to Carbondale, the road was planked. And that's what the horses and the carts and the stagecoaches would go on. One of the buildings that was recently torn down, the Woodland Inn, that used to be an inn and a stagecoach stop along the way where people could spend the night. It was also where one of the toll booths were, where you would stop and pay a toll to use the road. And they would use that to keep up probably the world's largest boardwalk, even though it wasn't at the seashore. Now, 2 years later, in 1846, when the gravity extension to Archibald was completed, Sly's shop, his blacksmith shop, was joined by a general store, a hotel, a private school. And these institutions were followed in 1847 by a post office, a public school, and then in the early 1850s by a Catholic church, a German evangelical Lutheran church, and a Presbyterian church. In the spring of 1846, the original planes for the loaded track were not the ones that were on the present gravity railroad. They were two separate ones, and they were called Plane 1 and Plane 2. Number 1 mine, they ran down to that far, and it was hoisted up 2 planes at the top of Number 5 hill, and then the cars would roll down to the other side of the mountain of their own momentum. To the foot of Davis's plane, which was in Carbondale, where they would send it over the mountain. This mine opening was on the edge of White Oak Creek, about 400 feet east of the D&H tracks, where the White Oak scale stood. While the head of the plane was opposite the Jordan residence on Hill Street, the foot of Number 2 was about 200 feet north of the head of Number 1, which was behind Lewis Auto's house. And so the original loaded plane track through Archibald was on the east side of Hill Street at the mouth of the mine and would go up Number 5 hill. The original light track came down along the same line, but what would happen is it would meet at the mine opening. So there was rail transportation until 1858, as far as here in the valley. The location of these old planes, which were an important part of the gravity railroad between 1846 and 1859, can still be traced. If you go up and you walk along the ridge behind the houses on Number 5 hill, you can still see some of the cuts that were made in the rock ledge for this railroad on Hill Street. As I mentioned, the light track was not changed. The cars would roll to the top of the Carbondale Mountain and then roll to the mine openings in Archibald. There were no coal breakers at the time, and the coal was not prepared for the market at the mines. When the D&H began taking coal from what was known as the creek level on White Oak Run, the gravity cars, which came in to be loaded, were dropped from one branch, that would be the light track, to another, by means of a strong hemp rope that was wound around a tree stump that was near the mine, and that stood close to the mine. Now, on the other side of the river, where the Eaton mines were, the first openings were for the Eaton Coal Company, later become Jones and Simpson. They were made on the West Mountain above Main Street in the summer of 1856. And to get the coal to the gravity cars, an inclined plane running parallel to the openings was constructed on the hillside, and that was along here. To get the coal, then it was double tracked with a weighted truck in its descent, would pull the empty cars up to each mine opening, and they would be able to draw the cars to each mine opening. They would fill them with coal. When they became heavier, the car would weigh more than the weight. They would control it by a wheel at the top with a brake, and it would come down to large chutes that were at the Skoblik residence. Skoblik residence, if you go over Gilmartin Street, it's the first house across Main Street. It was the Dixon Coal Company store, but at that time there were large chutes for the coals. And what would happen is then they built a trestle across from there that would, by horse, they would draw the cars over across the river, and they would connect to the number 1 plane, and they would send them up over the hill and into Carbondale and then to Honesdale. Now, this was how that company would get their coal on the D&H line until the spring of 1859, when the railroad was extended to Oliphant. Because when the railroad was extended to Oliphant, the loaded track actually ran right through the coal chutes of the Eaton breaker. And we'll see that in a picture later. So there was no need to have this extra trestle over the river, and it was torn down. As I said, Archibald was the southern terminus of the Gravity Railroad from 46 to 59. All the freight received for and from the residents of the Lackawanna Valley as far as Pittston was received at the depot, or the storehouse as it was commonly called, which stood about 100 feet south of Hill Street. Because of the large freight business even then, the depot was about 60 by 100 feet, and it was always packed with goods. This was especially the case in the spring and in the fall, when the merchants of the valley would go to New York City to place their order and to do their buying. And it would take from 2 to 3 weeks for the shipment from New York to reach the valley. They would take it up the Hudson to the opening of the Delaware and Hudson Canal, then down the canal to Honesdale, then on the railroad over to Carbondale, then down to Archibald, and then, again, the reason for the extension of the planked road, they would load their cars and take them down that way. That played an important part with the Erie Railroad, because the Erie Railroad had a commission to have the railroad finished by a certain date. They had to have it finished by 1847. And what happened is there was a problem getting the T-rails from England. And this helped the Scrantons to develop their own business, because the Scrantons then put a bid in at much cheaper per ton for the T-rails, manufactured them at their blast furnace in Scranton, and they would draw them by carts up the planked road to Archibald. And then here in Archibald, they would be loaded onto the Gravity Railroad. They would be taken over to Honesdale, put on the canal, and taken to the site where the Erie Railroad was being built. And as a result, the Erie Railroad didn't go into bankruptcy. They were able to complete the railroad before the deadline, and then the railroad had been saved. Now, this is the earliest map that I have of the area. The map is dated 1864. as you can see on the map, that the extension to Oliphant was complete. And there's some interesting features on the map. One is, there's 3 churches. And I better point them out because that's not coming out right. Right here was this Catholic church, St. Thomas. Then, over here, was the Presbyterian church. And the building stood on its original location until it burned down in the 1970s. And what's also interesting is, right here, and I've never seen this on the map, they have the location of St. Luke's Lutheran Church. The first Lutheran churches were built in that same location. The first one was built and burned down before they ever got to use it. And then they built it in the same location, and then after the fire on Hill Street, they moved to Main Street. I guess 2 fires in the same location weren't too well. They were too close to the breaker, too many sparks, and it kept burning down. This is the first map that I found that had the original location of St. Luke's.
How far up Hill Street was it?
Hmm?
How far up Hill Street was it?
It was about 100 feet where Rock Street comes down in that intersection, about 100 feet up from that. Also, what's interesting on this map, okay, is the cemetery down here. If you notice, the original Catholic cemetery, that's only a half a block. I guess as more people died, they needed to extend it further. The other thing that's visible is right here. You can see where the D&H had dammed the Lackawanna River and dug the canal down alongside to Seaplane. And here at Seaplane was the water wheel that operated the inclined plane to bring the cars up the hill. Okay, that was in effect. You'll see it on some other photographs. Also, some other interesting things. Over in here, okay, we have the Eaton breaker. Here, where the White Oak breaker stood on this map, it's called the Bird's Eye breaker. What happened is, the D&H leased lands and coal out to other people, and a Dr. Birdseye leased all of this land on this side of the river as an investment. And so instead of the White Oak breaker, they called it the Birdseye breaker. So on this map only, it's listed as the Birdseye breaker. There is a hotel here that's called the Archibald Hotel. And right up in this area, right at the base of the number 5 hill, there's a house or a building that's listed as J. Archibald. There's no evidence that James Archibald lived in the town at all, but for whatever reason, there's a house listed with his name on it. This is a larger portion of that map. If you'll notice that basically Archibald was about the only town or the largest town in the area. What happened is it was part of Blakely Township, and it was one of the reasons why a lot of the other towns had separated from Blakely Township first, and Archibald didn't separate from become its own borough until 1876, because they had the number of people, they had the votes. They ran the school district, they ran the township. And these newer developments like Blakely and German and Jessup and Dixon City, in order to have a vote, they had to separate and form their own boroughs. And that's what they did. And then in 1876, when the remainder of Blakely Township was left, Archibald just incorporated all that land into Archibald Borough. German only has a few houses and is called Rushdale. Later it will be called Gibsonburg, and then later German. Also, just off the map, there's a small town that's starting to develop because of the Gravity Railroad that's called Mayville, and it was later changed to Mayfield. You'll notice that mining hasn't started in the Einan section of the borough yet. That's in this area. Jones and Simpson had just put a road over to there, an extension. Right here, there's a school built. And what's also interesting is, right here, it's the only map that we have, that the Welsh Calvinistic Church, the Welsh miners, or the Welsh farmers, were Calvinists, and they built their own church next to that cemetery that's at the end of Betty Street. That's the only map that we have with that church appearing on it. And that was built in 1848. Also an interesting feature, even though the new loaded track was here, on this map you can trace the old two planes that were in effect going up the east side of number 5 hill. Plane number 1 and plane number 2. And it's right in this area that they joined the loaded track and went to Carbondale. Years later, this is a map from 1847, and you can see how the town has developed and it's grown. All the way up each side and down Main Street. This is a map of Blakely Township. Again, the same time. You can see how all of these towns have developed. Jessup had grown, Blakely's a borough. Priceville is down here, which is later to become Dixon City. And also named after D&H people. Oliphant was named after a president of the D&H at the time, and Dixon was also a president of the D&H. This is a picture of Archibald around the same time, about 1864. This section of the town was where all the activity was. Town Square was here. That's the newly built White Oak Breaker. They just started to build breakers to prepare the coal before they would send it to the railroad. Before this, they would take it up to the Ratchetbrook Breaker in Carbondale to prepare it. If you notice over here, there's still houses on the East Mountain that are there. In a short time, that's going to be covered with a calm dump, and it's going to be the highest dump in Pennsylvania. Here's the Gilmartin Street Bridge, and there's somebody's laundry still hanging out on the line. In almost all these pictures, you'll see somebody with laundry hanging out on the line. Another picture taken at the same time. You can see the White Oak Breaker. You can see the Presbyterian Church. Right here is the dam across the Lackawanna River. And you can see how the water was slack here. It would go over, and there's the canal that would travel down to the water wheel in this area and go up Seaplane to send the coal cars down to Peckville and to Oliphant. Here's another picture taken from the same location, but this one was in the 1880s, and you can see there is a much greater development. The town has grown. You can still see part of those old road beds for plane number 1 and plane number 2. Notice that there's now 3 bridges across the town. There's 3 tall churches. St. Thomas, the Presbyterian, and St. Luke's has built their church, and the old Archibald Graded School was built here on the site which would later become Archibald High School and is now the park over here. And the main street is now developing with merchants all along that area. By 1892, you can see that the town even developed greater. All of these areas are now filled in. This section of the town, Dutch Hill, and going over to Einan, all the way up North Main Street and number 5 Hill, is now residential area, and the town was basically about the size that it is now. Now, there was a Mr. Hensel. He lived in Port Jervis at the time, but he also had residence in Hawley. And he did a number of stereoscopic travelogues. He made a set for the Gravity Railroad, and he made a number of slides of Archibald, more than most of the other towns. And luckily, almost all of the Archibald photos survive. And I see Dave Shindemi sitting in the back there. He has a stereoscopic viewer with him, and I have some of the original slides. So after the presentation, if anybody wants to come up, we'll slip them in, and if you want to see what it looks like in 3D, you'll be able to view that. On the back of each card, he had published the whole list of what was going to be shown. And what they would do is they would check off which slide it was, and they would also write the number of the slide up here, 137. Here's a close-up of the ones that covered the Archibald area. The only one that I don't have is 134 and 140, which is a view of German from the head of plane number 27, which is on the top of number 5 hill. Recently, I found at the New York Library, and I sent for a copy of it. I just have an internet copy tonight to show you. But this view of Archibald and the coal breaker is seen from the bridge at the foot of plane number 26. That we didn't think was in existence, but we found that there's one in New York. So, the first slide is 135. This is a view of the Gravity Railroad from the head of number 25 plane, or D plane. Just to give you an idea, D plane was coming up from Oliphant, and this would be Peckville in this area. It would pull the cars up from Riverside and then send them through Archibald. And we're looking at it from that direction. And here you can see the plane. It's from the head of the plane. Here you can see the cables going down, the road continuing down from Peckville. Also in this area you can see a board that's held against the tracks so that when the cars came up and they were disengaged, if they started to roll backwards, that would kind of catch them and prevent them from rolling backwards down the hill. Notice also that in this time, there's steel ropes that are being used. Roebling, and you may hear him because of the Brooklyn Bridge. Roebling first tested his suspension theory and using these steel or wire ropes on the Delaware and Hudson Canal Aqueduct up at Lackawaxen. And they all expected the aqueduct to collapse when the coal would go across. But what people didn't realize is that once you put the water in, that was the total weight, because the boats displaced the water and the bridge didn't increase in any weight when we went across. And he was so successful then, he got the contract to start the Brooklyn Bridge, and it was his method. His son finished the work for him. But also, they started manufacturing these wire ropes or steel ropes. The chains would break. In place of that, they would use 2.5-inch hemp ropes, but they would wear rather quickly. Then they went into developing these steel ropes that lasted a lot longer. From the head of D plane, then the cars would roll down Kennedy Drive, down along the east or the west side of the main street, and they would roll all the way up to Frogtown, to the foot of B plane. Next slide is 136. And this is a view of Archibald from the loaded track. And again, that's the direction we're going to be looking at. This is from back on Main Street. If you were standing there now, you would be standing just down the street from Dave Shindemi's house, right where the Green Hill Road comes down. You'd be standing on that area. You'd be seeing the Lutheran church that has a different steeple, the Presbyterian church, St. Thomas, and you can see how much higher the column pile began to develop on for the White Oak Breaker. And you can see the old graded high school here. And somebody's laundry. The next view is of Archibald and the coal breakers seen from the railroad. This is slide 137. And this is the direction we're going to be looking at along the loaded track. So here it is, back on North Main Street. This is the D&H hay car. There's one man, see him here with this hat? He's going to appear in a lot of pictures. A lot of people kind of think that he was maybe, you know, an official at one of the steam engines, but he just appears in all. Here is the Eaton Breaker. Remember I mentioned that when the loaded track was built, the track came right through the coal pockets, the Archibald High School and St. Thomas Steeple.
Hey, Mr. Hensel had a propensity of putting himself in every picture.
Maybe that's him.
Yeah,
There's some close-ups of him in a little.
he's in every picture.
Also notice here up on this area, the track is slanted back towards the breaker, so they would put gravity cars in it. They could just roll them down, fill them up, and then send them on their way. This is a better picture of that breaker. It's taken from the light track looking across Main Street. It's the Eaton breaker that was part of the Jones and Simpson company, and it would be later replaced by the Raymond breaker that was between here and Iden. Another view from an early map. You can see the breaker, you can see the loaded track coming down, and you can see where it goes to cross the river on bridge and then start up number 5 Hill on the new tracks.
What year is that?
Pardon?
You know the year of that?
1892. This is slide 138. View of the railroad bridge at the foot of plane 126, or B plane. And it's taken in this direction. And here you can see the railroad bridge crossing the Lackawanna River. In a couple of photographs and a couple of books, this is misidentified as the bridge that went from Peckville to Oliphant. And it's not. One of the reasons that we know it's not is because they have the original slide from the maker, and he has indicated what that slide is. And also, the other reason is the bridge was slanted between Peckville and Oliphant so that the cars could roll over it. So this was the bridge that crossed the river in Frogtown, took the cars to the base of number 5 Hill, and they would start on their way up.
What side of the river is this being taken from? The
That's
side?
the light track coming
It's
down
on the
from
east side of
Germany.
the river?
Yes.
Oh.
Mhm. And this is the new slide that we found, slide 139. It's not a good copy, but it's a view of Archibald and the coal breaker seen from that bridge that you just saw in the picture. Okay, and it's looking this direction. You can see the bridge here. On the better pictures, these are all the houses along North Main Street. You can see the light track coming down into Archibald. And right in this area, on a clearer picture, you can see the White Oak Breaker. And again, the steeple from St. Thomas Church is visible. Hopefully, when I get a copy of it, we can bring it in and look at it here. Now, these next two are from the top of number 5 Hill, and this is where you can see if Mr. Hensel is in these pictures. Okay, slides number 1132, 1133. This is from plane number 26, or B plane. And it's looking down this way. Okay, it's taken from inside the house at the head of the breaker, or the head of the railroad. Again, this man is appearing in the picture. You can see the cables coming up.
Pretty good.
Here's the next one. Here again, same guy with the hat. He's now standing on the other side of the opening in the house.
Gotta
He
be-
just happens to show up. Does anybody know what Hensel looked like?
Yes, they do. Sure, we'll
Is
get-
that him?
It looks like him. He always wear that top hat.
All right, then
What
that's
about
what it
his
is.
car? Where's his car?
He puts his car in a lot of them too. He couldn't get his car up there though.
Probably couldn't. Also notice here, there's a wooden shim, long pole on it. That was how they would hook and unhook the cars.
Who would operate his camera if he was standing there? They didn't
Well, they
have
had-
the automatic shutters like they have now.
He had
Took a long
assistants
time.
that took the picture.
Yeah.
He framed the picture, then he had somebody just pull the cap off, and most of them were time-lapse photography.
And it was stereoscope, so there must have been two lenses in order to get the two
There were
different.
two cameras, yeah.
Yeah. This is the engine room inside of Plane C. After they converted it from the water wheel, this is what the engine room looked like. There were two steam pistons here and here, okay? And then the wheel here connected to the drum that would pull the wire and the gravity railroad up. Here's a picture of seaplane, because we don't have one of that. You can see the O&W bridge has already been built. This would be where the baseball field is in Laurel Street.
Yep.
One interesting thing here,
Mhm.
a lot of the railroad people were concerned about seaplane, because if for some reason, especially with passenger trains, if for some reason this got loose, it could roll back down to the bottom of the hill. But they had turnouts that would derail the train. The other problem was, you had to make sure you got past the bridge, because they couldn't put any turnouts to derail it. They kind of breathed a sigh of relief once they got that far.
Charlie Clotter, is that by your house?
The building at the top is TR Associates right now.
No, I see.
Alrighty, some remains that you can see of the gravity railroad that are found in the borough. Okay, this map is 1888.
Yeah, it's a good man.
And if you overlay a current topographical map on it and line up the lines, you can pretty well map exactly where the gravity railroad was listed. Down in this area, back off Main Street, you can still see some of the rails beds that were intertwined, where one is in one direction, one is in the other. If you go to the end of White Birch Drive, there's a cut that they're filling in there. That was the cut that was made for the foot of D-plane to start up the hill. And this is D-plane running right along here. That is seaplane. Nope, wait a second, sorry. That is Gravity Street in Archville. Gravity Street was built right along where the Gravity Railroad, the light track ran. Right here, it was originally called Kelly's Corners. Now it's the corner of Kennedy Drive and Main Street. And what happened there is they made a connection between the light track coming up this way and the loaded track coming this way, so that they could bring the light cars up here and send them back down to the Eaton Breaker without having to send them all the way to Oliphant and to have to come all the way back.
I think the red on that is where they mined the coal already.
Is where what?
They mined the coal already.
Yes.
That was
yeah.
the workings.
Mhm.
That map is great, very accurate.
That section of the road you used to be able to see along the edge of the road at Henry Street in Archville. A little while ago, the borough crew was doing some sewer work up in that area and put in a new guardrail so no one would go over the hill. And in order to do that work, that part of the railroad was taken away. Also, when they cleared all that land on the right side of Kennedy Drive going up the hill to put those new stores in, they took away all of the roadbed that was there. Another interesting thing with here, with this angle, if you notice that field where it says, don't post any signs, right next to the Starlight Lounge, okay? Do you ever notice that the property line is angled? Okay, well, actually, the reason it was angled is because that was the railroad came through. And people bought property on this side and people bought property on that side. So it's a good indicator of where the railroad was. You mentioned where the head of seaplane is. If you go up in that area that they just cleared out behind the Archville Ambulance Building, there is a set of concrete steps. And those are the concrete steps that were for the engine house at Seaplane. They could have been moved, but that's where it was originally. If you follow Park Street down in Dark Valley, Park Street is where the Gravity Railroad light track used to come through, go where the baseball field is, and then come up the other side. So Park Street is where the roadbed was. And if you go back on Spring Street, up on Green Hill, you can catch up with the loaded track as it runs behind the houses on Main Street, and you can walk it all the way back up to the original roadbed, up as far as Louis DeFazio's old ice house. This is the next section of the map. Again, you can walk the loaded track all the way up. Also, if you look behind the houses along behind Main Street, you can see the original stone walls, retaining walls, that were put up for the Gravity Railroad and for the breaker. So as you're going up Main Street, look to your left, and you can see all that stonework that's behind the houses. That's all Gravity Railroad work. And when you get to the last house, where the wall comes around, and Louis' ice house was there, that's where the bridge was that went across the river that started up Number 5 Hill, right in this area. Now, what's very interesting is B-plane and A-plane are still pretty much intact. There's nothing there, but the roadbed is there, and the rock cuts through the walls for the road to go are still plain, still very easy to follow, and you can walk it up. I think Sammy's been up there a couple times recently, right?
Yeah,
The only part that's lost
still there.
is right in this area, well, right now, and if you notice, there's double tracks up here, triple tracks. That's where they would make the larger trains up. After they got 5 cars at a time up to the top, they would then assemble trains and then they would roll all the way into Carbondale. This section is gone because it's the spillway for Aylesworth Dam. Before the dam was built, you could follow it around, but now they've cut that part of it out. Also, this section is now gone because of the Casey Highway.
Someplace on there is Edgerton.
Pardon?
Someplace on that map is Edgerton.
Yes, it's on the next section. Now, if you walk back to the back of the spillway, you can pick up the roadbed again. It's still there. And the light track is pretty much intact from the base of Hill Street all the way up to the cemetery in the Nebraska section of the borough. What happened is, after the Gravity closed, the D&H converted it into a steam line. And after the conveyor belt at the top of the Gravity slope breaker down here collapsed and they tore the breaker down, they used to run a steam train and take the coal to the Powderly breaker in Carbondale and have it processed up there. That collapsed in 1942. So this section, this light track section, is pretty much intact, and actually you can walk along it or ride along it with your quad or your mountain bike And you could see the railroad as it would come down through the woods. This next one is the part that also includes Edgerton, okay? And you can see the Edgerton breaker here. You can see the rail lines that it had. You can see the mine openings. And you can see the area that it had mined as of 1888. Because here they had a second railroad that ran around this way, and they were also mining coal on this side of the mountain.
I think where
Now,
you
pardon?
left off, I think that was, I think the D&H mined that coal, the last one that you pointed to.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think Edgerton could mine that coal. They had to go all the way around that mountain.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think their lease went into that area.
Actually, the land is owned by Benjamin Ryan.
Yeah.
So he was and also this area was owned by the Hillside Coal Company.
And you see how the Edgerton mines stayed right on the line on
Right.
the east side.
The
That's-
D&H Canal Company owned this
Yeah,
side.
they mined all of that. It's
Yeah.
tremendous mining.
And this road, even though it's not part of the gravity, this roadbed, I was on it a couple of years ago with Quad. That's the railroad that went to Edgerton, and that's still available. The second dam, you know that Aylesworth is a flood control dam.
Yes.
So what happens is when they close the spillway, the water backs up. And if it backs up along this Edgerton Creek here,
Yeah,
when you get to here, it would begin to flow down into Childs.
yes,
So there's a second dam back here
that's correct.
to prevent it. So right at the end of the dam, you can pick up this railroad bed and follow it all the way down.
That was the original Aylesworth Creek.
Mm-hmm.
When they put that dam up.
Right, the creek used to run down
That's
that way.
correct, you're right, right. They made it go the other way, right.
So the loaded track would come down, you'd pick it up at the end of the spillway, and right along here,
Yeah,
this whole section, they cut the side of the mountain out, and the roadbed is all visible all the way along. And when I was trying to trace it, I could never find out where it went from there, until I saw this map and realized
yep,
that in this section they built trestling to take it across. And there was no roadbed, the trestling had long been gone. But if you go to the other side of the hill, right in here, you can pick it up again, and you can follow it into Carbondale.
is that the road that you drive up that Edgerton?
No, no, it's up above it.
I see, that's another one, okay.
Mhm. Yeah, it's right, it's,
Higher, yeah.
Higher than it. if you know where to look, there's plenty of remains around. Since I first walked it, that was back when I was working on the history book, and that was in the 1870s. A lot of the things have disappeared simply because there's new construction. But you can still find a lot of things that are available. Now this is something new that I had found on Life on the Gravity. It's the story of George Lawrence. And this is George. And the Lawrence family is closely linked to the history of the borough. George Lawrence was head of the Gravity Association in 1934. And in the June 1934 edition of the Delaware and Hudson Corporation Bulletin, they had this story. A man had to have sound judgment, a keen eye, and nimble fingers to hold a job at the head of a plane on the old gravity railroad, says George Lawrence, who prior to his retirement on pension on June 1st, 1932, had completed over 56 years in the Delaware and Hudson employ. When a string of 5 loaded cars reached the top of the long inclined plane, the stationary engineer would give him slack in the steel cable, and in the following instant, the headman had to grasp the hook which engaged the cone in the heavy rope, and with a flip of the wrist disengage it. Should he fail to release the big hook, he was greeted with a series of remarks from the engineer which were not altogether complimentary. And the latter had to hastily reverse his engines to avoid causing serious damage to the cable, the cars, or his engines. Interesting thing on this picture, when you blow it up and you change the contrast on it, you would think that these are all information. They're girly calendars.
Blow it up.
So, at that point, he wasn't yelling at anybody. He was looking at the girly calendars. Nowadays, when a freight train stalls on a grade, the engineer has a number of alternatives. He can back down and get a fresh start. He can cut the train into sections and take it up one at a time. Or if another locomotive is available, he can call for assistance. In the early days, if a train, which ordinarily ran down the slope between adjacent planes by the force of gravity, stopped midway between, the runner had to walk to the foot of the next plane, the next inclined plane, to get one of the powerful horses which were stationed there for emergencies of this type. Returning to his train, he would start it with the assistance of the horse and then complete the interrupted run. There were stories that some of the mules or horses got used to riding on the trains back, and they got to where the cars were and they wouldn't pull them, they wanted to ride back. Not infrequently, boys of the neighborhood who frequently rode the cars along the level would deliberately stop a run of cars to annoy the crew. When one of the culprits was caught, he was given a sound thrashing, although it is doubtful whether this discipline had any effect other than to cause him to repeat his prank on the very next opportunity. And here we came across a picture. This is an accident. This is above Main Street. This is White Oak Run. This here, you remember Buddy Kenny had an old barn that you could see from Main Street. So this is up above Foots and Barrett's Pub. The gravity has overturned and the guys are bringing the cars back up to get them back online.
That's a total amount of horses.
Even before his birth at Archibald, PA, July 13, 1865, Mr. Lawrence's family was connected with the mines and mining and transportation of anthracite. His father, for years, was weighmaster and later breaker boss in the employ of Jones and Simpson Coal Company. And again, that's the Eaton breaker that was part of that coal company. And George, after a single term of schooling between the ages of 6 and 7, went to work in the old White Oak breaker at Archibald. And that's the old White Oak breaker, about 40 years after it was built. He would work picking slate 12 hours a day for 42 cents a day, which rate was later cut to 39 cents per day. All day long, youngsters ranging from ages 6 to 10 years sat hunched over the coal chutes high in the breaker, slowing the flow of coal with their feet while they removed and threw into a nearby box any slate or rock they might see. As long as the percentage of refuge which escaped their eyes was kept to a minimum, all was well. But should the foreman consider that they were missing too much, their failure was harshly called to their attention by the sting of a falling whip. This colliery, which at the time had a capacity of only 450 tons a month, long since burned to the ground, and it says it was never rebuilt. But actually, there's the fire in 1899, and that breaker was rebuilt. Okay. This is again the old breaker. After 3 years as a slate picker, George was promoted to the job of running empty coal cars under the breaker chutes for loading, his wages automatically being increased to 54 cents per day. A supply of empty cars was at all times available at the head of the slope passing by the breaker, and as soon as one had been filled to its capacity of 4 tons, George had to place another one under the chute. 5 years later, George was now 19 years old. In fact, in this picture, I did blow this up because this was a glass negative. And when you look at his face, the guy sitting there, that's George.
It was a hand.
Let's see. 5 years later, George was now 19 years old, was made an extra man at the breaker, doing a variety of jobs throughout the day. At times, he would drive a mule to the top of the mountainous calm bank where the refuge from the breaker was disposed of. At other times, he would run cars on and off the scales while their contents were being determined by the weighmaster. Coal from this breaker was sent to Carbondale and was used on steam locomotives of the Delaware and Hudson. This was the replacement to the White Oak breaker. And when this is enlarged, if you look, you can see a man with a mule dumping the waste here and here. The waste was taken up to the top, and they just kept doing it higher and higher. Meanwhile, George had made a number of applications for the position on the Gravity Railroad, although in each instance he was refused because of his small size. This only served to intensify his desire to become a railroader, an ambition which had been growing on him ever since the steam railroad had been built through Archibald when he was 5 years old. Finally, Frank Peters, a gravity section foreman, agreed to give him a trial and put him to work tending the head of plane number 5, or D plane, at Archibald at $1.55 per day. Work at the head of a gravity plane was by no means easy, and a man worked from 6 a.m. until the last loaded car had passed. If, however, he worked until 8 p.m., he received an extra quarter. Although, should he quit as late as 7:59, he received straight time, and the work was usually arranged so that a man did not receive any extra overtime. Oftentimes, a cable or a link would break, and a string of cars would start back down the plane, gaining terrific speed in a short distance. To prevent any serious damage to the foot of the plane, traps were built in the track at intervals. These traps consisted of spring switches, which were closed by the wheels of the ascending car, but immediately opened again behind it, so that any cars descending the plane would be derailed. After 6 years at the head of the plane, Mr. Lawrence became a runner, operating trains of the gravity cars between Archibald and Carbondale. In the morning, he would leave the foot of D plane, which would be the base down there, okay, with anywhere between 5 to 85 cars. At the foot of each succeeding plane, he divided his train into sections of 5 cars each for hoisting to the top. And he rode the last section of the group. The entire train had to be coupled up again, and then the downgrade run to the foot of the next slope. Thus he worked his way to Carbondale and back 3 times to complete a day's work, for which he received $1.90. Mr. Lawrence continued on the gravity until it was abandoned in 1899, when he was transferred to the foot of the trainsman's roster on the Pennsylvania Division. For a number of years, he was a member of conductor Wallace Dimmick's crew, which transferred freshly mined coal from Powderly and No. 1 collieries to Ratchet Brook Breaker, where it was processed for marketing. And that's Ratchet Brook Breaker that was up on the side of the Carbondale Mountain. For 5 years between 1909 and 1914, Mr. Lawrence was on the Hudson Oneida fast freight line, going north one day and back the next. At the time, it took an average of 16 hours to take a train from 45 to 50 cars from Hudson to Oneida, with what could be considered to be the present 700 class engine. Today, twice as many, and this is 1934, many cars can cover the same route behind a class 1200 locomotive in less than 6 hours. Mr. Lawrence completed his 56 years in the Delaware and Hudson employee as a yard conductor at Carbondale. Veterans often asked which they preferred, work on the gravity line or on the steam road. Mr. Lawrence is unqualifyingly for the steam road, since a man who went out on a steam haul train knew beforehand what type of work he would do that day. On the gravity, a man might work on a train or a plane one day and be set work tamping ties the next. Mr. Lawrence is a chartered member of the Delaware and Hudson Veterans Association and has served as vice president since its organization. For 14 years, he has been president of the Pennsylvania, Delaware, and Hudson Gravity Association, which is composed entirely of men who worked on the gravity railroads, and which hold an outing each year at Scranton at Nayard Park. He's also a member of the Independent Order of Oddfellows and the Lutheran Church of Archbold. Mr. Lawrence, who lives at 108 Monroe Street, Archbold, has 4 children: Mrs. Henry Morcom, Mrs. Arthur Miller, Miss Ethel Lawrence of Archbold, and Elmer Lawrence of New York City. I'd like to thank you for your kind attention, and if you have any questions, I'll try to answer them for you.
How about a comment?
Go ahead.
Well, we're from the Wayne County side, and we've been to many programs put on by Kurt Reed, who has done Pennsylvania Railroad, and has touched on the D&H gravity, but mostly dealing with the Wayne North to Holmesdale route. And so this is a good perspective and very informative on seeing it from this side, so thank you for inviting us.
You're welcome. You're welcome. And in our centennial book, we have more information, including who built the planes, who built it. There was a group of people living in Germany, and they got the contract for building some of the bridges between here and Archbold. And the son had one contract, the father had another contract, and the son lost $1,500 on his contract. And he had an argument with his father, saying that his father had lost $2,000 on his contract, so therefore he was more successful because he lost $500 less than his father. So a lot of that material's in the history book, and we didn't repeat it here tonight. We're glad you came down from Holmesdale. Glad to have you here. Any other questions? All right, I'll turn the meeting back over to you.
Thank you. Very informative.